Boker Tov, morning on this fine Sunday, first Sunday after Pesach, after Passover. And I know that we're going to have a good class today. Why do I know that we're going to have a good class? First of all, because as a result of giving tzedakah, starting off with a mitzvah, we're going to have blessing from God Almighty for today's discussion. And second of all, and also importantly, not as important as the first, of course, is that we have our coffee cup back today. It was put away with all the chametz dishes, with the non-Passover dishes, and we have our cup of coffee back. So it will definitely be a blessed class. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol neh b'dvaro. And thank you for the cup donor for this wonderful contribution to our class. I want to make it clear from time to time I say this based on feedback that I get, is that this class, this Torah discussion that we have together is not one of these quick 30-second or 90-second or 60-second reels story. This is a Torah class. So settle down. We're going to discuss and elaborate, and if it takes us into some side little rooms and chats, discussions, we will do so within the limitation of a certain time frame. So that's that. So the topic of today's class is capitalism versus socialism as a segue to a story in the Talmud, meaning it's not a comprehensive class on capitalism versus socialism, nor is it my interest to go into in-depth discussion on that, even from a Jewish perspective. Perhaps we've done it once in the past, perhaps we'll do it in the future, but it's more a beautiful story in the Talmud, and it's a lesson that we can learn from it, and it's connected to the Haggadah. We're coming from Pesach. It's all interconnected over here, and with Hashem's help, with God's help, we should be successful in conveying the insight into this meaningful discussion that we're going to have today, into this story, Talmudic story, and so on. Okay, so, on the basic discussion, capitalism versus socialism, much has been written about that in general, sort of secular articles, writings, thinking, philosophers, and so on. The virtues of each of these systems, the pros, the cons, and like every human developed sort of system or human ideas, it has its limitations. We are finite. There's pluses, minuses, and the general discussion when it comes to capitalism versus socialism. Those who argue for capitalism is that's part of the basic human nature, to do what's best for yourself, and in return others will benefit. When you stifle human desire for self-interests and self-growth and acquiring your own personal wealth, then it overall, for the general sort of society, loses out of that sort of restriction or limitation. Whereas in terms of capitalism, everybody ends up gaining in one way or another. The argument against is that unrestricted capitalism brings about too much selfishness and greed and corruption. And socialism has its benefits or arguments for, where it makes sure that every individual, nobody is left out and everybody is looked for, and there's no class warfare. And there's the limitations of that. So that's a discussion that's been going on for years. And people have tried to make sort of improvements or what we might today call mixed capitalism, which is probably what we have in this country. It's or in Western societies in general, it's more of sort of a mixed capitalism where you try to preserve the virtues and the motivations and the drives of capitalism, with government setting certain regulations to try to prevent corruption and try to prevent sort of class warfare, or try to prevent the poor and the have-nots from being forgotten, and so on. So this is a basic summary, I believe. Am I leaving things out? I'm sure I am, but this is a known discussion. We don't have to come to a Torah class to hear that discussion. I will say, as we discussed in the past, a lot of these systems, a lot of these a lot of these systems, I don't have a better word that comes to my mind right now, all only work when there is an underlying healthy moral character within society. When there's a non-healthy moral character, none of these systems work as they should. Which of these systems are better when there's a non-moral, healthy, underlying character to a society? It can be argued. But if for them to work properly, so we spoke, when was it, a week or two ago, about freedom. This country is very much based on freedom of expression. I mean, that's a virtue, and perhaps the best system that we can come up with, but it's not a perfect system, and it's much more of a perfect or well-functioning system when there is an underlying moral code, moral behavior within that society that has the virtue of freedom. Because if you only have freedom, so freedom to do what? Freedom to express your desires to sort of animalistic behavior, to cruel behavior, to destructive behavior, even self-destructive behavior. So again, whether that is the best government system, perhaps, but as an individual human being, we always have to make sure that we have the best system sort of for ourselves and our family, regardless and independent of the societal or government system. And the same thing is with capitalism versus socialism. Of course, here in the Western world, we have adopted, for the most part, a capitalistic society. But even that is only healthy and works to its best potential when there is proper underlying moral code. And from here, we get to a discussion of, whose morality. And that's why when you have maybe government deciding, there are certain limitations to what morality government can decide. While at the same time, if you have a society that does not have healthy and proper morals, then government unfortunately also becomes corrupt. Government as sort of the safeguard or the watchbearer. Am I saying that word correctly? As the protector of what's right and wrong, and law enforcement is not enough, because unfortunately, government and government institutions in the Western world as well often becomes corrupt, and with the overwhelming power that government can have, a corrupt government can be dangerous, can be highly dangerous and destructive for a society. So these are some of the problems. Now, Judaism and Torah, where does it fall on the socialist versus capitalism, is a discussion that I believe we've had in the past. You could tilt it in whatever way you want, I believe. I'm not the top expert on this field, definitely not, but just my sense of my studies and learning, I would say that, like everything in Judaism that affects so many areas, all areas of life, but also areas that have high. Let me shut this off. Sorry, that have areas of a lot of passionate divide in this country. So Judaism very much is based on the underlying foundation. It's underlying, but it's critical in our life. The underlying foundation that it all is not about rights primarily, although Torah gives us rights, but ultimately it's all about responsibilities, and the ultimate decider of rights and who brings meaning and morality and purpose and is the one who gives us life. Every morning, the first moment we open our eyes, we say, thank you, Hashem, for giving us back our neshama, our soul. And life is based, and values are based on that knowledge and that deep belief and core foundation of what our entire life, family, society is based on. So therefore, when the question of abortion would come up, or the question of capitalism versus socialism comes up, all these questions are on an individual basis. Again, I'm not talking about government basis, which is a little more complicated, but on an individual basis, it is, okay, what are my responsibilities? What is my underlying absolute moralities based on Torah, which gives us the knowledge and instruction and insight of God, what God wants of us. And that's why within Judaism, a lot of these concerns of capitalism versus socialism have been resolved, not to perfection, because we are human beings and we do have temptation and we do have weaknesses and we do sin, but there is a very strong emphasis on both individual rights and responsibility in terms of earning a living, providing for your family, and being motivated to live a life where you could live comfortably and provide both for your family, but I would also add, and provide for your community. The mitzvah of tzedakah, of giving charity, which in Hebrew, tzedakah means actually being just. The mitzvah of tzedakah and social services that are existent in a community is beyond just a complementary. It's an obligation, and therefore you're not going to find somebody in a Jewish community who goes hungry. Everybody will step up to the plate and make sure that they don't go hungry. So this is sort of a combination. I want to share, and I know we've taken up a lot of time on this discussion, which maybe should have been more towards the end of the class, but I want to share an interesting story in the Talmud and a couple of questions. First, let's go to the Haggadah. The Haggadah begins when we say Magid, and we are about to say the Haggadah. When we say Magid, we say that we start off with an invitation, right? We say, hey, Lachmanya, this is the bread of affliction. And we talk about the bread of affliction, the Acholu Avasona Ba'arad Mitzrayim, that our forefathers, our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And then we continue and we say, Kol Ditzrich, whoever is hungry should come and perform the Pesach with us and should come and eat with us. And commentaries ask a question. It seems to be out of place that we are now extending an invitation to all that are hungry. We should have done that a week before Passover, 2 weeks before Passover. Now that we're sitting at the Seder table already, we make this proclamation. Whoever is hungry, it's like you have your doors locked, your windows closed, and you say, whoever needs a place to come eat, come eat. Doesn't seem to fit in the right place. Let's put that question aside for a moment. And hopefully I will get back to this question. If I don't, remind me, because sometimes in the conversation, I can sometimes forget one of the questions that we present over here. So you're welcome to remind me. Okay. There's a Talmudic story in tractate Psachim. Psachim is the tractate that deals with Pesach, and both the laws of the prohibitions of Passover regarding chametz, the positive mitzvahs, of course, of eating matzah, the bringing of the Paschal lamb, which was done during the days of the Bet HaMikdash, the laws of the Seder. Many of the laws related to Pesach is, of course, or most of the laws related to Pesach is in tractate Psachim. Okay. Change of decision over here. I decided I do want to answer the Haggadah question, and then I will come back to this Gemara. The Rebbe gives us a wonderful insight into why we say the invitation to the Seder table as the opening phrase, before we even say the Manishtana, as the opening phrase of the Magid. Rebbe says the following. Rebbe Amir Menachem Mendel Schneerson, he says the following. He says, this opening phrase called Ditzrich, whoever needs should come and eat, is, in addition to the straightforward meaning, is coming to tell us something more. The invitation for Pesach has already been taken to come to, for a person to have their Seder, has already been taken place. In fact, by Jewish law, already from 30 days before Pesach, one is obligated to take care of what's called Kimcha de Pischa or Mois Chitim, which means to make sure that people have matzah for Pesach. I think already 30 days before, there is the communal tax collectors can actually impose a tax on people living in the city to make sure that all the poor are taken care of, have where to go for the Seder. The Heilach Ma'anya that is said at this point has the reason why it's put in over here is not so much as an invitation to outsiders, but as a message to the ones sitting at the Seder table, and an opening statement, as we're about to say the Magid, the telling of the story of Passover, which is all about re-experiencing what the Israelites, the Jews, went through on Passover night, the experience of freedom, which is an obligation to try to sort of recreate and get there and understand and experience and internalize that feelings of true inner freedom. What does that mean? And this is why we don't even say it. We could have said it right before we start the Kiddush. Why not say it there? Right before we make Kiddush, Kol Ditzrich, right? But we say it as an opening phrase of the Magid. Magid is the obligation to tell the story. This is the opening phrase of telling the story. Says the Rebbe something very beautiful. The Rebbe says, when you want to experience true freedom, you know how you do so? You do so by on a deeper, emotional, spiritual level, when you stop thinking about yourself and you're thinking about somebody else. Naturally, as we spoke about capitalism versus socialism, naturally we have more, we think about ourselves and the universe evolves around us. But that is very enslaving when you're only thinking about yourself. In some ways, that's the biggest prison you could be in. We declare at the beginning of the Seder, you want to experience true freedom. Remember, you must go beyond yourself. You must think about someone else. Only then are you truly free. I remember reading a story. There's a fellow who wrote a book. Not good with remembering names. A fellow wrote a book, an Italian philosopher, Jewish philosopher, who went through the Holocaust, similar to Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote a book called, I think, Is This Man? He wrote a book, and in there he relates a story, and in that story he describes the first moment that he felt liberated from the horrors, enslavement, from the prison of Auschwitz. He says it was towards the end of the the war, everybody or many of you are familiar with what was known as the Death March. The Death March was when the Germans were losing the war and they had to leave Auschwitz, and they started the very tragic and infamous Death March, where all the prisoners, or most of the prisoners, were taken. Most of the inmates in the camps were taken on this Death March. Many of them who survived the horrors up to that point died during the terrible conditions of the Death March. But there were some, for whatever reason, were not sort of shot or put into the gas chambers, but there were those who were frail, sick, that were left behind. I guess in the haste, the Germans didn't even have time to get rid of them. They were left behind in the barracks as all the Germans left. So this author relates that some of us were better, a little stronger than others. At one point, as we were there in one of the barracks, and it was freezing cold. This was still probably, I think it was in February, I'm not sure at the time, but it was still cold, very cold. So they went ahead and they boarded up, or they sort of plugged up the windows so that it wouldn't be as cold, so unbearable inside the barracks. And one of the sick individuals there made an announcement. His announcement was in appreciation for those who plugged up the windows. I want to propose that we all give a small piece of our bread that we have as a token, or as a sign of deep appreciation. Let's give it to those who helped us survive by plugging up the windows. And the author writes, he says, you need to understand, up to that point, what the Nazis did to us. We were reduced to animals. Everybody would do anything to get an extra morsel, an extra piece of bread, even stealing from somebody else their daily bread, which could mean the difference between life and death, was totally the norm, because we became so animalistic. Just a basic instinct for survival. He says that moment when we were able to come together and give away of our basic life-sustaining nourishment for each other, at that moment we felt liberated. That was the moment that I knew I was liberated from Auschwitz. And now to the Talmudic story, with keeping the discussion we've had up to this point in mind. Now to the Talmudic story. This Talmudic story is about Hillel HaZaken, the famous Hillel. Hillel is mentioned in the Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of Our Fathers. He's mentioned, and he is quoted with one of the most famous statements in Pirkei Avot. If I repeat this Pirkei Avot, if I share with you this Pirkei Avot, I am sure many of you can give me a thumbs up that you knew this Pirkei Avot. And we spoke about this last year, but today we're going to give you a little bit of a different perspective. The Pirkei Avot is this Mishnah. Hillel says the following. Hillel says, Im ein ani li mili. If I am not for myself, who am I? Ukashat, do you recall this Mishnah? I'm sure you do. Ukashani la'atzmi, if I'm only to myself, mani, what am I? Statement number 3, v'im lo achshav, and if not now, a must I then when? Famous statement of Hillel with many interpretations, including this simple, basic, straightforward interpretation. The Mishnah is a classic, beautiful Mishnah. Although the first two statements are a little difficult on the, again, straightforward pshat level. what is its connection to the third statement? If I'm not for myself, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if I'm not now, when? If not now, when seems to be somewhat of an independent statement. And last year, or 2 years ago, already, we've spoken on, we've taught this mission. But today, I want to share an insight from the Rebbe of how he explains the Mishnah, because there's a klal, there's a general rule, shiv'im panim la Torah. There are 70 facets to every part of Torah. The Zohar even goes as far as to say that there are 600,000 facets or dimensions or ways of learning every piece of Torah, like a diamond that has many different angles. And the Mishnah and the statement from the Mishnah can be learned on many different levels, different insights. So today we're going to give a different insight based on the Talmudic story that we started to share. The Talmud tells us the following. We're learning a little piece of Talmud. I don't have the Talmud in front of me, so it's sort of memory. The Talmud tells us the following, and it's also related to Pesach, but it's also related to ethics of the fathers. And the reason why I picked this topic is because now during the month between Passover and Shavuos, we learn ethics of the fathers, and yesterday we learned chapter 1. This Mishnah from Hillel is in chapter 1. Okay, now, so Hillel so this is the story. Pamachas tells the Gemara, there was a time that Passover came out on a Sunday. And therefore, since Passover came out on a Sunday, the Paschal lamb during the days of the Bet HaMikdash was brought and slaughtered on the day before, on the 14th of the month of Nisan. Passover is always on the 15th of the month. Says the Talmud that they were not sure because slaughtering an animal to make it kosher is forbidden, is a biblical prohibition on Shabbat. But there are exceptions, and there are sacrifices in the temple that were brought on Shabbat. And the question that arose was whether the Paschal lamb is something that supersedes Shabbat. If it's doche, if it pushes away, if it supersedes Shabbat. So the leaders, the Jewish leaders, the scholars of that time were the Bnei Beseira, a family of leaders both leadership and in Torah. And the question was brought before them, and this alma mimen halacha, the law became lost to them, became covered up is the literal translation, but it means they forgot. Nitalma. And they said, is there anybody who would remember and know what is the law? What are we to do? Do we bring the Paschal lamb on Shabbat, or does it get pushed off to after Shabbat? Talmud tells us that the people responded, yes, we believe there is somebody here in the crowd, not in the crowd, but someone that's here that will know the law, because he was a student of Shemaiah and Avtalion, the great leaders Shemaiah and Avtalion, the leaders of the generation before. Who is this? This is Hillel HaBavli, Hillel that came from Babylonia. This occurred in Israel. There was a large segment because of the exile of the first, after the destruction of the first temple. There was a large segment of the Jewish community and the scholars that were in Babylonia. Hillel came here from Babylonia, and we could ask him. So they asked Hillel. What is the law? So Hillel says, I'm going to keep it short because we have time limitations after all. Hillel basically says that yes, the Paschal lamb does override Shabbat. The Talmud continues that they were so impressed with Hillel's knowledge and greatness in Torah that they minuhu nasi aleim, they appointed Hillel to be the leader, and he became the great Hillel HaNasi, Hillel the prince, Hillel the leader of the Jewish people of his time. Till today, Hillel is Hillel. So, like every story in the Talmud, there's a message, but there's also first a discussion. The discussion over here is what's the deeper understanding of it? What was the question? What was the question whether the Paschal lamb is doche Shabbat or not? What's the underlying doubt over here, or thinking that caused this doubt? So there are sacrifices that are doche Shabbat, but these are what's known as karban tzibur, communal sacrifices. Those are doche Shabbat. For example, you have, the Torah says that on given holidays, you have to bring certain sacrifices, but they're from the community. You have every single day, you have what's called the Tamid Shal Shachar, Tamid Shal Abayim, the daily offerings. Those were communal offerings. Those are doche Shabbat. They supersede Shabbat. Individual sacrifices. For example, the Torah talks about in Leviticus, there's certain sins that one commits inadvertently, you have to bring a personal sacrifice. Personal sacrifices, individual sacrifices are not the doche Shabbat. They do not override Shabbat. They do not supersede Shabbat. So here, this was the underlying question. The Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, has elements within it. It's the only sacrifice that is a little bit of both. Meaning, there's elements of it within it that you can conclude defines it as a private or individual carbon, and there are elements of it that make it more a communal, a joint karban, a joint offering. How so? Unlike the Tamid Shal Shachar, unlike the daily offering, every individual, says in the Torah, every individual has to bring a Korban Pesach. However, there's a caveat over here. When we say every individual has to bring, what we mean is every individual has to be part of a Korban Pesach. On the other hand, the Torah right away tells us, V'lo kachu u'shchenoi. The Paschal Lamb is not bought by an individual in the typical sense. He has to bring it together with a neighbor, or the Lashon Chazal, it has to be bought b'chabura, has to be bought in a group. Since the Torah, God wanted that the Pesach experience should not be, as we said before, a selfish, self-indulging experience. The Paschal Lamb was bought as a group with many individuals joining. So imagine before the Korban Pesach came, you had to reach out. The other day, someone was complaining to me that he lives in two different neighborhoods, in the north in one area, in the south in another area. Actually, the other way around. What I meant to say is, in the winter he lives up north. Yeah, like many snowbirds. In the winter he lives down south. In the summer he lives up north. And he said that in this area, the neighbors, he knows the neighbors, they interact, they socialize together. In this neighborhood, the neighbors are just cold and so on. So before you had to bring the Paschal Lamb, you had to reach out to neighbors, to friends. Would you like to join and be part of? So this was the question that the Bnei Beseira had, the Bnei Betera, the underlying question. Is the Paschal Lamb a private offering, and therefore it does not supersede the holy Shabbat, or is it more like a communal offering as it's done in a chabura, it's done in a group setting? It has to be done in a group setting, and therefore it's analogous, it's more compared to the laws of a Korban Tzibur, or at least has both within it. And Hillel, based on the teachings of what he heard from his teacher, said it does supersede Shabbat, which means that while the Paschal Lamb is definitely also an individual sacrifice, nobody doubts that, since every individual has to take part, it's also part of a communal sacrifice, and therefore it overrides Shabbat. And as mentioned before, because of this story, and because of his sort of deeper understanding into what's going on here and being able to rule on the issue, he became the Nasi, the leader. As usual, story in Gemara, many commentaries, we don't have the time to go through all that. A lot of interesting stuff over here. But I want to share one thing in the line of the theme of today's question with another question. You know, every question is answered with another question, the Jewish way. So there's a question that can be asked over here. Why is it that it's specifically this story that landed Hillel the leadership position. Yes, he showed that he's a scholar. Yes, he showed that he had a deep understanding. But there's so many stories, and I'm sure they asked him more questions that Hillel was able to prove his greatness in Torah and his greatness of character and holiness and so on. We must say, since everything in Torah is exact and has meaning, that there was something in this particular story that showed his greatness to the extent that it impressed him and said, this is a leader. He shouldn't be our leader, not just has a lot of knowledge. Knowledge versus wisdom versus great character versus moral character. So here the Rebbe also gives us a beautiful insight, and he connects this Talmudic story with Hillel's famous statement, one of his most famous statements, as we just mentioned. He says we could understand the Mishnah that we learned, that if I am not for myself, who am I? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? In the context of this story. This is al derech hadrash, what we call more of a homiletic understanding, with a beautiful lesson. He says the statement over here deals directly with the question of the past kalam. If I'm not for myself, who am I? In again addition to the simple meaning that I got to take the reins in my hands for myself. Of course, we don't negate that. But in the context of this story, it means with the Korban Pesach, the Korban Pesach is about every individual participating, every individual taking part, recognizing the significance, the infinite value of every individual and their contribution and their responsibility and their purpose. The Korban Pesach shows that I have to be part of the Pesach, I have to contribute, I have to take part in. However, if it's only an individual, then no, I will not fulfill the mitzvah of the Paschal Lamb Korban Pesach. I must understand that my individual greatness and strength takes on a whole new dimension and strength when it recognizes, thinks beyond myself, as we spoke about the story of the Haggadah, and unites with others, both in recognizing the power of others and in realizing my greatest potential. In Jewish law, when we have a minyan, for example, it's not just 10 individuals. There are certain laws that and holy rituals and prayers that can only be said when there's a minyan. Because as Kabbalah, Hasidus teaches us, there's a whole totally higher level of holiness that exists when there is a multitude that come together. Which is why he says, if I'm only for myself, money, what am I? Perhaps we could suggest that what he's saying, again, in the context of applying it to our story, as great as I am as an individual, and I need to step up to the plate, relative to the greater level of coming together with others, money, I'm nothing. That is so far superior and greater on a powerfully spiritual, holy level, that it's like, money, what am I if I separate myself? If I separate myself from the community, if I'm only thinking about it myself, if I'm not part of the community, whatever qualities I have become pale. So here is, and then in the context of the Paschal Lamb discussion, if not now, when? Meaning the Paschal Lamb is today, I can't push it off to tomorrow or the next day. This is of such importance, I got to do it now. In conclusion, why was this the story that motivated, inspired, that the sages all agreed upon, that this is our leader? We step aside as we are the leaders, and we hand over the mantle, the crown of leadership to Hillel. Because these three elements are key to a true leader. A true leader values, recognizes, pays attention, brings out the best in every individual. There are leaders, especially when you talk about politicians, they look at the total of numbers. One falls off, Look, as long as I have the majority, who cares? A true great Jewish leader throughout history, like Moses and all the great leaders, paid full attention and gave all of their love and all of their focus to the individual. Nobody was insignificant. Nobody was left behind. Famous song by Avraham Fried, "No Jew will be left behind." No individual is left behind. On the other hand, a great leader recognizes the power of developing, of enhancing, of supporting whatever a community has to offer and encouraging the individual to be part of a community. That is what a true leader does. Any great leader always pays attention to the community institutions. That's what a great leader does, because that is necessary for the individual, necessary for the community, and its continuity. And ve'im lo yachshavei masai, like the Korban Pesach, leaders recognize and seize the moment for themselves and for those who they lead, because they realize how much is at stake when an opportunity that veils itself, or a need that's there now, cannot be pushed off. We don't know about tomorrow. We don't know if what you're overlooking today can sadly be a loss, and to use the Lashon Talmud, B'chiyah ledorot, could be something that you cry about for generations because that opportunity that came was missed. And that's why it wasn't just the halachic answer that Hillel gave, but the deeper message over here and the keen sensitivity that the sages saw in him, that they said, he will be our leader. So this is a beautiful insight into this whole story and the lesson, very real lessons that we take in our life and those around us, and our sensitivity to ourselves, to those beyond ourselves, our family, our community, society at large. By taking these lessons, these wonderful, important lessons, which help create a healthy moral society where all these other virtues and isms can function in the most healthy and productive way, that will bring blessing to ourselves, to all of us. And as the Rambam says, every and any good deed tips the scale. A person should always view the scale as even. One good deed tips the scale for the good, and mevi Yeshua v'hatzala, and brings salvation to the entire world. May Hashem bless you all. Thank you for listening, for giving me the opportunity to not only think about myself, but to share these words of Torah, and hopefully inspiring words of Torah, to make both me and the listeners one step better as human beings, one step more caring, one step more connected to the community at large. Everybody have a fantastic and wonderful week.